Last week, I talked about starting the remake of my jam game A Rift Between, and the challenges of bringing it to 2.5D. This week, I turned my small test scene into chaos. In the last devlog, there was an enemy alien in the test scene, but other than wandering around, they really did nothing else. So this week, it was time to give that alien their attack. After using scriptable objects to make the crafting material scripts last week, I'm starting to see how they can be used to really help keep things organized, so I wanted to use them to manage a lot of the reusable stats of the aliens in the game. When planning out the project on Millinote, I gave all the aliens a bunch of variables and highlighted the ones each specific alien would be using. With having this base of variables to go off of, I just added the same variables to the scriptable object. I used bools for things that only certain aliens would use, and ints for things like max speed and max health. To use this new scriptable object, each alien type would need a way to access the variables off the script, so I created a manager for the aliens. The first alien type in the game is based on our jumper class. Their specific attack is based around jumping in the air and slamming the ground, so I added a function for their attack called ground slam. The first thing this function does is grab the current health off of the player and store it in an integer, then toggles a bool letting the script know that it's time to jump. Once the bool is set to true, it grabs the current position of the player and subtracts it from the position of the alien. It then takes this and normalizes the values. Doing this lets the alien know where to launch in position to the player when adding force to the alien's rigid body. The actual jumping in the air is handled by an animation that is toggled by a bool in the ground slam function. This gets set back to false once the slam is finished. When I went to hit play after adding these scripts, instead of the aliens flying towards the player, they would just stand there and look up as if confused by the character standing in front of them. After several different attempts at trying to get the alien to move, it turned out that the nav mesh agent was preventing the rigid body from doing much of anything. To be able to disable the nav mesh, I also had to disable the alien's movement script, otherwise there'd be a ton of reference errors for the movement script looking for the nav mesh. For turning them both back on, I added them to the finish slam function where I was setting the animation of the slam back to false. So it was time to test out the slam again. To really give the slam an impactful look, I wanted to create dust that would hit the ground when the alien jumps and then when they land. There are a couple of ways I thought of how to make the dust. The first would be to instantiate a bunch of prefabs of the dust, all containing rigid bodies so that they fall to the ground. The other way is using the particle system, and is the way I chose to go for the dust. The first thing I needed was a sprite to use, so I made one really quickly and added it to the particle system. Then I enabled gravity for the particle system and adjusted some values until it was giving a nice burst. To make it trail out a bit at the end of the burst, I enabled size by velocity and reversed the ramp so that it would start big and then get smaller and smaller. To make the particle play with the slam, I added it to the ground slam function and added a coroutine that waits a second, then destroys the spawned particle system. The next day I chose to work on adding in one of the other aliens. I decided to work on these super small ones I'm calling Swarmlings for now. They spawn in swarms and scurry all over but do not actually hurt the player. To make these, I used the same movement and enemy manager scripts from the first alien and removed the call to the slam ground function when the player is in the area. Back in the Game Jam version, these little Swarmlings already had a death animation. Since we're using the Game Jam art for now, I added the animation and set it up to be the same way as the original alien. By doing it this way, I didn't have to make any changes to the code because it's still looking for the exact same thing. When planning the project out, one of the environmental things are egg sacs that can contain these swarmlings, so I felt like it was the next thing to work on. To make the egg sacs spawn the swarmlings was fairly simple. Since I wanted to check for a collision, I gave the egg sac a collider and set it as a trigger. I then made a script for the egg sac, and in the script I gave it a public game object to put the swarmling prefab into, as well as an integer for how much damage it would take to break the egg, and a transform for the area to spawn the swarmlings. Then, on an onTriggerEnter function, if a game object with a tag of projectile hits the egg, then it runs a function I made called hurtEgg. Inside of the function, it lowers the integer for damage by the amount it was hurt, and checks if it was enough to break the egg by running another function called checkIfBroken. Inside this function, it checks if the integer is now equal to 0, and if so, it runs a loop to spawn all 4 of the swarmlings. When I went to test the egg sacs, it was spacing out the swarmlings really far apart even though they all share the same spawn area. After trying to do different things with their rigid bodies and being stumped for a bit, I opened the prefab of the swarmling and could see what was wrong. The nav mesh has a collider that it controls, and it was set to the size of the original alien instead of the new tiny ones. So I adjusted its values until it fit around the swarmling nicely, saved, and hit play. After squishing a ton of the swarmlings, it was time for the next task. In the game, the player uses various types of ore to break down into atom and craft things. Back in the Game Jam game, all the ore was dropped by enemies on death, but with this new game having larger explorable areas, it made sense to have deposits that could be harvested. To make these ore clumps, it's almost the exact same as the eggs, but instead of spawning the Swarmlings, it spawns the ore assigned to the clump. To give it a bit more of a boom where the ore clump is broken, I used a function called add explosive force. This function simulates an explosion on the object's rigid body. I'm really happy with the clumps and how they turned out. The burst they separate with gives the impact of breaking the clump a really good feel. Having all this ore you can collect and deposit is great, but without a way to use it, there's not a lot of point in collecting it, so I chose to work on the Atom Smasher next. The Atom Smasher is the first crafting item the player can craft. Once it's repaired, the player can use it to refine down basic ore. For the Atom Smasher, there would need to be some form of UI, so I made a placeholder area for the text to be readable. Inside of the script, if the player uses an assigned key, it brings up a text box and checks if the station is already repaired. If it has not been repaired yet, the text updates and checks if the player currently has the ore needed to repair the station, and if not, tells them how much they need. When the station is repaired, it takes the amount needed for the repair and subtracts it from the script that holds the references for the ore. If the player refines their ore, it zeroes it out on the ore on hand and adds the corresponding atom to the script. There's definitely a better way to handle this mess of nested if statements, but for now it's working as intended, so I called the Atom Smasher done. I think during this next week I'll need to make a bigger test scene, as this one's becoming fairly cluttered with the amount of objects crammed onto the platform. But for now, it's time to relax and enjoy some tea. Until next week.